My name is Tom Blackson, and this is a video in a series of videos I'm making for a class I teach at ASU, PHI 328, History of Ancient Philosophy. This video is about Plato. Now, we've been thinking about Plato's dialogues against the background assumption that he writes them to uncover the significance of what the historical Socrates thought and the unusual way he lived his life. This task has two parts. Plato first shows what Socrates thought and how he lived, and then he tries to fill in details Socrates does not supply, and also he tries to correct Socrates when he thinks this is necessary. We can see Plato filling in missing details in the Meno and the Phaedo, these are two Platonic dialogues, with the theory that's traditionally called the theory of recollection. Socrates, as Plato portrays him, seems to assume that his interlocutors have the right answer to the what is it question. He asks in his search for definitions. Right, this is what we've seen in the earlier dialogues. Their problems, he seems to assume, is not the absence of true beliefs, it's the presence of false beliefs. Dialectic, the question and answer that Socrates engages in with his interlocutors, helps them abandon these false beliefs. And when they've abandoned them, they're supposed to be left with the right answer to Socrates' question. The theory of recollection, the theory we see in the Meno and the Phaedo, helps make sense of how Socrates could be right about this, right? So this is an example where Plato's filling in missing details. The first place this theory appears is in the dialogue, the Meno. Meno, he's the character in the dialogue, and the dialogue's named after him, complains that no one can answer Socrates' question. In response, Socrates gives an example to show what happens when someone does give the right answer. He helps one of Meno's slaves come to the right answer about a question in geometry. And if we look here at the notes, we can see what this question is. All right, so the question is how to double the square ABCD, right? So ABCD. And this construction shows you how to get a square that's double of that square. And Socrates, in his conversation with Meno's slave, helps the slave get the right answer. And we can understand this as follows, right? So once the slave comes to the right answer, Socrates takes us to show that we have the right answers, right? They're something that we have all along because we have this power of the soul, reason. Okay. This is what in the notes I call the epistemological thesis. The thesis is supposed to explain how it's possible to know the answers to Socrates' question. Okay, and so this word epistemological, right, comes from a Greek word. I think I might have it here at the bottom of the page. Let's take a look. Yeah, here it is. So just means knowledge. And so we call this part of the theory of recollection the epistemological thesis after this Greek word. And the thesis is that, right, we have reason, this power in the soul. That's part of what we get when we have a soul, insofar as we're human. And according to this thesis, right, reason and includes more than just the ability to make inferences and thus to engage in reasoning. It includes concepts we use when we make inferences. And these concepts are what Socrates is asking about when in the Meno, the dialogue, for example, he asks Meno to tell him what virtue is. Socrates says further that engaging in dialectic, right, in this episode that he has with Meno's slave, he says that engaging in dialectic is a matter of recollecting the content of these concepts. We can see some of these passages over here, where I've quoted from the Meno, where Socrates is saying these things. Here we have the word recollection. The suggestion is that the process is a little bit like trying to remember where we left something. The first answers that might come to mind might turn out to be wrong. That's always what happens in the early dialogues with Socrates' interlocutors. Their first answers to his question about what some ethical, some virtue of character is, always turn out to be wrong. But the idea is supposed to be that once we eliminate those, the right answer will eventually come to us and we'll remember, quote unquote, what the answer is. Okay, so the theory of recollection has this epistemological thesis in it, and it also has an ontological thesis in it. And the ontological, like the epistemological, is really just taken from a Greek word. Let's see here, I'm pretty sure it's down here, we can see it, right? So here's the Greek word ontos, which is a form of the participle, is a present participle of the verb here, which means I am, and the infinitive means to be. And so ontology is words about existence, like epistemology is words about knowledge. And so the ontological thesis is the second thesis in the theory of recollection. We can think of the theory of recollection as a whole as being constituted by these two theses. And the theses can come apart. So later we'll see Aristotle will accept the epistemological thesis, but reject the ontological thesis. The ontological thesis is about the existence, right, of the soul. And Socrates, at least as Plato represents him in the Meno and the Phaedo, believes that the soul exists before it enters the body and also after, when it leaves the body, when we die. Now, part of what is interesting about this thesis, let's bring it up, part of what's interesting about this thesis is what Socrates says is supposed to happen to the soul when it enters the body. And Socrates talks about this mostly in the Phaedo, right? So remember, we're looking at two dialogues, the Meno and the Phaedo, and he makes the claim about the soul being able to exist apart from the body in both dialogues, both the Meno and the Phaedo. But he explains what happens to the soul when it enters the body, primarily in the Phaedo. And what he seems to be doing, what the character seems to be doing, remember, he's a creature of Plato's imagination. Plato makes the character say what he says. And he seems to be giving an explanation, making the character give an explanation for what the historical Socrates, for the life the historical Socrates lived. Remember that he was very aesthetic in his life. And we get an explanation for why he lived that way. And the explanation is embedded in the ontological thesis, right? So the idea is supposed to be that when the soul first enters the body, the shock of incarnation makes it forget itself and take on the concerns of the body, starts living a life appropriate to the body. From its experience of pleasure and pain, it forms beliefs about what's good and what's bad, and it lives its life in terms of these beliefs, right? It tries to get pleasurable things and avoid painful things. That's how we start out living according to this picture. Now, the lover of wisdom, remember Socrates himself thinks of himself as a lover of wisdom. The lover of wisdom, Socrates explains, is realized what has happened to the soul, right? So most of us, according to this story, we don't realize what has happened to the soul. We just find ourselves living a certain way, namely trying to get pleasure and trying to avoid pain. And we get Socrates saying that the lover of wisdom realizes instead, and we have all these passages down here that I've quoted for you, instead, really, the body has imprisoned the soul because what happens, we form our beliefs about what's good and bad from our experiences of pleasure and pain. And now we live a life appropriate to the body, not the soul, which is what we ourselves are supposed to be. We're supposed to be souls. And so the lover of wisdom understands that in order to take control of his life, he has to resolve to live aesthetically. He does this to help himself abandon the false beliefs he acquired from his experiences about what's good and what's bad. Now, there's, of course, a lot to this picture that can seem puzzling to us, right? But if we leave aside the worries about how the soul might exist apart from the body, the other puzzle is about abandoning the beliefs about what's good and bad. This can seem puzzling to us because we can be tempted to think that to abandon a belief just really is just a matter of concluding that it's false. You don't have to do anything else. But Socrates, at least in the story that we're getting, seems not to have thought this. And we can see what he had in mind a little bit more clearly by looking at an example. I think I have one down here. Yeah. So suppose that I grow up eating sweets, and from my experiences of eating them, I get the belief that eating them is good, right? And then later, right, I become aware of the arguments from medicine that tell us that eating sweets is not healthy. Now, I believe that my health is good, so what do? I resolve to stop eating sweets. But this, right, this is not supposed to be enough for me to stop believing that eating them is good. To abandon the belief, I need to live aesthetically, right? I have to practice believing that eating sweets is not good by resisting the urge that comes upon me to eat them. And over time, as I get better at resisting this urge, right, I can reduce my liking for eating sweets and thus eventually abandon my belief that eating them is good, right? So what we see here is an explanation that Plato's trying out for why Socrates lived in the aesthetic way he did. Okay. Now, right, as I said, there's lots of puzzles here, and especially about the separate existence of the soul. But I think we can see in these dialogues, right, in the Meno and the Phaedo, which are what we're thinking of as being in the middle dialogues. Now, the Meno in particular it's hard to classify it because it has features of both the early and the middle dialogues, right? The middle dialogues are characterized by these Platonic theories, theory of recollection, theory of forms, which I'll talk about next time, the tripartite theory of the soul, and eventually we'll get to the theory of justice. But the Meno also is representing Socrates in a search for definition. In this particular case, it's for virtue. So the Meno has these characteristics of both the early and the middle dialogues. We don't have to think that the distinction is so right, so precise. So I'm not going to worry too much about that. We can treat them as both part of the middle dialogues. And we can see that at this point in his life, right, Plato's still using the character. The character Socrates is still leading the conversations in these dialogues, but now the character seems to speak more for Plato than for the historical Socrates. It's no longer Plato trying to give a portrait of the historical Socrates. It's now Plato trying to supply details he takes the historical Socrates to presuppose, but to have never set out in his discussions.